Hello. Oh, no, not yet. Three. Oh, sorry. Hello. We are live. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, Lavanya. Welcome. Where are you coming to us from today?
Hi, Andy. Yeah, good morning to you. So I'm joining from the very rainy Yokohama today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very excited for our conversation. Can we start there to give us some context? Where did your journey begin? Where were you born?
As you could see, I am an Indian, and I was born in India, brought up in India, spent half of my life over there before I moved around the world. So I can really say that I am truly an Indian at heart, and actually, being born in India, where so many cultures assimilate, has shaped me to be where I am today. So it's been an eventful journey to Japan.
Yeah, I'm sure it has been. And before we come to Japan and before we dive into some of the topics, I'd really love to just get a little bit of a flavor of what it was like for you growing up and some of those cultures you were exposed to and how that shaped you.
It's actually very interesting. Like I said, India is it's very diverse as a country. So when you are born and brought up in India, it's very natural for you to recognize that you are among different people. So it comes naturally, and your whole thinking is shaped by this diversity because you need to be more explicit when you talk because you're talking to different cultures, different people from different backgrounds, ethnicity, religion, you name it, and there would be more. So growing up, it's been a very interesting story, I would say. I was born in a conservative family, I could say, very Indian conservative family. And my nuclear family was a bit different from the larger family. My father was more modern in his outlook, and he wanted the girls to study and all. As I grew up listening to all these noises about why are girls studying. They should get married. They should start working. Why are you letting your girls to go into university? So you actually grew up in that kind of environment where women are stifled. Things like, don't laugh too much, sit straight. You're a girl. You're not supposed to do that, right? And it just makes you think a lot. Even now we do that. If it's a girl, it's a pink. If it's a boy, it's a blue. If it's a girl, buy a kitchen set or a Barbie doll, or if it's a boy, give them a car. So we kind of do this conditioning, and that's what I saw growing up. But also the plus point is you grow up in India and you're exposed to a lot more than you usually in some of the homogeneous cultures. So you adopt yourself very quickly, and you either challenge or you give in, right? So I would say I'm the person from the other side, that's challenging side of it. So I guess I started being a challenger from my childhood and got into women empowerment when I was in the university and started being very loud about gender diversity and talking about women's rights and all that. So I think that's what brought me out of India as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really helpful to understand the starting point, and it's good that your father had that attitude, and already you were being encouraged to do things slightly differently, and noticing that was the case, and also being your normal was lots of diversity already, lots of different ethnicities. And so when did you start getting some idea of the direction that you wanted to go in terms of career?
I was born in a family of filmmakers, so I think that made a huge difference. My grandfather was one of the earliest actors in silent movies, and my father was a producer. So basically, I did grow up in studios. Like after school, we end up going to a film studio and just watching films being made, and sometimes being called into a studio to say, "We'll give you a chocolate, cry." Dubbing, cry like a child, and I'll give you chocolate. You just go in, you dub, you get a chocolate, you go away, which looked like very normal. But what it did was storytelling became part of my life. And to a large extent, a cliched Indian way of thinking is either you become an engineer or a doctor. In those days, even commerce was like the in thing. But I started bending more towards storytelling and literature. And I was also into performing arts, and it comes naturally when you grow up in a family like ours, where filmmaking is common. So we were trained in dance, and I was into theater. So I knew that my line of work would be somewhere in the creative field where I'm doing stories. It's just so happened that half of my life I did that too. So I did radio documentaries, I was a critic, and I won national awards as well. But suddenly life took me towards corporate. And I ended up in communications because that was the closest thing that could use what I bring to the table, that storytelling.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, to be bringing your theatrical background, your storytelling background, your performing, being able to speak, bringing that into the corporate arena. And so let's talk. Shall we go to Japan? Shall we come to Japan now and talk a little bit about
I'll come
your
to Japan.
experience there? So thank you. Now, what was it like then? You've set the scene in terms of the diversity in India growing up. Japan is quite a different place. So I think actually you came via Southeast Asia, didn't you? You had another posting. So has that, tell us a little bit about that before you got to Japan.
Yeah, I always say this, that working in Southeast Asia before coming to Japan was like a preparation phase. It's a good transition for me because I moved from an extremely competitive, diverse environment in India to coming to Southeast Asia, where I started becoming, as such, if you're into creative field, you are a little bit more conscious about your surrounding. But I was also, because I was born in storytelling family, my cultural curiosity was also a little bit higher, I would say. And coming to Southeast Asia, I started learning a little, first and foremost, it was like slowing down. Suddenly the pace of your life is slowed down a little bit. And the reason I say it's a transition, because after that you come to Japan, you slow down even more. Because you're more poised to think, you're not running to compete all the time. But Southeast Asia was very interesting. It's so many different countries and so many different languages. I'm used to multiple languages, but when you actually have a different language and a different country, means different culture put together. There's a really different way of looking at things. And pardon me, I use the word different because different is so beautiful, and it really talks about what perspectives we get to the table. And I think I was telling you, Andy, about this is one thing I learned growing up in India, where we had so much of focus on learning English because you need to be very well spoken to make it in your career. That's what we were imbibed in our minds. And when you come to Southeast Asia and you bring that perception that the person needs to be able to be very vocal to convince you that they are good in their proposals, I needed to change that perspective. I started realizing language is not the sign of intelligence. So that's one big change I made, where listen to a person in his own language to really know the capability that the person brings to the table. And I think that helped me moving to Japan, because Japan is much more, focused on a single language. There's bilingual environment in Nissan because we are very, very diverse as a company, but you still feel that need to be able to understand culture without knowing the language, and assimilate yourself into that environment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You did explain to me that you realized when you went to Southeast Asia that you'd grown up with this sort of unconscious bias, if you like, based on always being measured against the perfection of your English language skills, and that was an eye opener for you that then prepared you. So could there be more of a contrast between Japan and India?
Oh, yeah, the contrast is pretty huge if you look at from a very personal point of view. But also in general, like, it's not true that you can say Japan is a homogeneous country completely, but it is into some certain extent homogeneous. They don't have the diversity to the level that you see in a country like India, right? So there is so much difference in the way of working. And one of the things that I just said about India, when you grow up in a diverse environment, when you know all your neighbors are a little different from you tend to start learning to be more explicit because you need to explain yourself more than in a homogeneous culture where you can take it for granted they're like me, so they can read in between what I'm saying. It's very similar. So that's the big difference, because when I moved, and typically when Indians move, they do have a natural tendency to explain more, because they think it's natural for them to be able to make it work with others who are different. But Japanese corporate culture is not the same, so it's more implicit than explicit. So you got to get used to it, where you can be seen as, oh, they are aggressive, they talk more. Why do they talk so much? Why do they need to explain so much? And you're actually on the opposite side thinking, why are they not saying anything? Why are they not talking to us in more detail? What's wrong? So you kind of have this kind of cultural clash, I would say. And you need to bridge this expectations on both sides, actually. One thinking talk less, and the other thinking talk more.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how you did that. And you mentioned superpowers in the this title of this talk is My Secret Superpower, Conscious Inclusion. So let's talk a bit about those superpowers. And one of the ones that you mentioned was super hearing. And you told me how you'd approached this when we spoke. So please just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say I give credit to one of my coaches for this, but it's not just in Japan, but this is a tool that helped me quite a bit, is first listen without any bias. Because one of the things we always do, and again, coming from a complex culture, is trying to read between the lines. So if somebody says it very simply, you cannot believe, how can it be that simple? There's something behind it. There's you need to read between the lines. That's a natural tendency we've got, right? So one of the first thing I had was the 30-day listening period. And it's very difficult, especially for people who are used to, in communications, used to talking, right? So I had to write down whatever I was thinking and not say it. So this was the tool that our coach said, okay, we understand you cannot control yourself from getting your thoughts. If that's the case, don't say it, just write it down. And I used to fill books and books of, when people are talking, I'm just listening and writing down my thoughts, but not saying it. Wait till the end. Don't give in to the temptation of talking when someone is presenting. Wait till the end and then decide whether you still need to say what you wanted to say. And in most cases, you don't need to, because they would have answered most questions if you have listened to the entire presentation by then. So that is something that helped me quite a bit, because I started paying more attention to listening.
And so that was a piece of advice you were given by a coach. Was this a specialist coach who was helping you, preparing you to integrate into the new culture?
It wasn't for Japan that they were doing. It was more of a management coach that we have at the leadership level. But I think that was a general tip which I could apply in this case. So, right. And this is where I say the superpower I have. The second one is intuition. And okay. This is where it's very important, because your intuition is the greatest way to be able to judge the skill that you have to bring to the table at the time that it is needed.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I'm going to dive more into intuition in a second. I just want to invite the audience to let the audience know that you're welcome to put questions into the chat and throughout the conversation. So you don't need to wait till the end, which is what we're talking about right now. You can write down your questions and send them across, and we'll try and weave them into our conversation as we go. So back to you, Lavanya. Intuition. Talk about leveraging your intuition.
It's a wonderful word. I think there's a lot of philosophy in India if you read through about intuitions. But intuition, our brain is so powerful, right? The human brain is so powerful. And we always call this sixth sense, gut feeling. There's something telling you this is how you need to read the room. There's something telling you maybe you should think about this way. And we often forget to listen to that voice, the voice in our head, however you want to call it. But we usually, because when you start talking, many times you don't listen to the voice telling you to do something else. And listening actually gets you to become more conscious about the voice in your head. That's actually your intuition. And intuition built over the period of time when you grew up in diverse environments and become more curious about cultures and become more unbiased, I would call it, you become more inclusive. So I believe intuition leads to conscious inclusion, because that's what tells you how best you can make out of the situation. And that was what, like this tool that I said, okay, you learned it in your management course, that maybe that applies here, because this will help me being more conscious about my colleagues who may need to more space for them to talk and may not talk as fast as you talk, right? So this ability to bring the intuition into your day-to-day work and listen to that voice is critical in conscious inclusion.
What I'm hearing is some behaviors, some intentional actions we can take to slow things down. So we don't, when we're listening to a presentation, don't react. If a question pops into our mind, don't react straight away. Write it down and reflect a little bit. Maybe you won't need to ask that question at the end because it will have been answered by the presenter. But reflect a little bit internally and listen to our intuition and let that get involved and let it guide us. So yeah, very, very interesting. And you also mentioned Japan being a bit slower than Southeast Asia, being a bit slower than India. Do you think is this because Japan's more of a consultative kind of culture?
Yes.
Okay.
I think the slowdown I talk about is very cultural as well, right? And it's related to the point of history that you are in. So I'm born at the time when India was opening up to the world, and the whole Indian intellectuals going abroad to work and all that. So there's a high competitive environment when we grew up. India is highly competitive. China is highly competitive. We are what we are, right? So when you actually are born in that country and brought up, you're always being on time to compete. So you're moving very fast, right? You got to do things fast. And second thing, it's very interesting. I may not be right or wrong. I don't know. I don't want philosophers coming behind me. But basically, a lot of things in India are uncertain many times because we are 1.5 billion people. So many times the traffic is not in our control, electricity is not in our control, the things are not in control. So your reflexes are pretty fast because you need to come up with a solution to an uncertain environment. You're very quick, you're very agile. Sometimes planning is not really good in India because no plan works. There's something going wrong at the end. Do you have the ability to immediately address that? And this term, I think, has been used quite a bit. Jugaad is the principle that many management schools talk about, is the Indian ability to come up with an ingenious solution to problems. This is coming because of the way we are, the environment we grew up. You come to Japan, where it's a country which is prone to earthquakes. It's so they made it a point to have a strong processes. They are very disciplined because they need to react in a certain way. So you're coming to a culture which is used to an organized way of working. The flip side of it is, if you want them to be like you, like the reflexes that you've got, the agility you have, they won't be, because they're not brought up that way, right? And in India, because it's the principle of reflexes, taking decisions have to be quicker. So individuals do have the ability to have a quick decision making power. While in Japan, it's a consensus culture. You gather around, you discuss, you make the decision as a team. So for somebody coming from this culture, it looks like Japan is slow, right?
Yeah,
This
that's
is
what I
I'm
figured you were saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so this is exactly what the cultural differences bring. So slow down is more about that. This is my perception, that it's slower over here. I slowed down, right?
Yeah, that's understood. So I have a question from our audience, Lavanya. Love your comment about language is not a sign of intelligence. What skills do you think are key for integrating into a different workplace culture that is a change to what you're used to? Now, we've already talked about this idea of slowing down, making notes, listening, reflecting before diving in. What other skills do you think are important for integrating?
I think a few skills I can immediately talk, because I keep talking about this all the time. One, uh, we have to remove prejudices when we come to cultures. And I did that when I moved to Southeast Asia, because you carry a perception, because you read, you listen to people saying, oh, that country, they're like this, that country, they're like that, because stereotyping is very, very common. But that's because we as human beings, I think, like to box everything into something, right? So to make meaning out of a certain thing. But that sometimes goes against inclusion and getting assimilated into cultures, because you look at full Japan as Japan. So Japanese are like this, Japanese culture is this, Japanese corporate is this, but it's filled with individuals who are very, very different. And if I box them already biased. So that's number one. Don't go with a perception. Don't box people. Second is, we always talk about be conscious about others, right? But we need to be conscious about ourselves, because we need to know what is influencing our decisions. If we don't know that, we won't be able to change. So don't expect others to change for yourself, especially when you move. One person is easy to change for millions of people than asking millions of people to change for one person. This is how I look at it, right? So I think the famous saying, if you are in Greece, you behave like a Greek person, right? I think these idioms come from good knowledge of what we are trying to say. Not like you need to lose your individuality. You don't need to, but you need to be conscious what would be the clashes, the tension that comes in when two cultures meet. And if you can really remove that tension, I think it'll be a beautiful integration.
It sounds like, again, just be aware of these things, have self-awareness, know how you're going to react to different stimuli, know how your behaviors are going to impact other people. And for the first few days, at least, be paying, all ears, watching, and gently step in. I remember you talked about dipping a toe in. You don't dive straight into the cold water. Just paddle into the sea. Don't just dive in. That was when we spoke recently. You talked about another superpower was mind reading. That I'm fascinated. There's another one coming about foretelling the future, but mind reading sounds pretty cool as well. So how does that work?
It sounds so science fictional, but
It does a
frankly,
bit.
it is. Right? But it is not. Like when you think about the concept of mentalists, we are talking about, oh, they may have some psychic powers, but it's not about that. I think it's about observation, the skill to observe. So if you're more conscious about your surroundings and you absorb everything that's coming in, your mind, the skill that I talked about, intuition, naturally is like a data processor. It's doing its job. That means the better you are at observing things around you, observing people, you will have the cues. And I think whether we call it body language or anything that we want to say, we have words for all these things. Mind reading is nothing but really able to get those cues from the other person, because there's something that will give away whether they are happy, they're dejected, they're convinced, they're not convinced. But again, this means, are you listening? Because
Yeah.
if you're not listening, you won't absorb all these things. You will never observe people too. You're just going on and on and on, right? So this is important. That's mind reading for me.
There's a question here, and I think you're answering the question, but I haven't given you the question yet. So let me just, in gratitude to the person who asked it, Deepali Danak, how do you think you can prepare yourself in advance for better understanding and seamless integration in culture? There are some mistakes that can be avoided. I think you're saying in this last passage, you've explained observation and slowing down, observing. And I'm fascinated that as a communications person, we think of you being the person out the front, knowing exactly what to say and when. What you're saying is say nothing to begin with, just listen, observe, be aware that you're likely to be prejudiced, you're likely to have biases, and your brain is likely to be sorting people into boxes as quickly as it can, even if it hasn't already through prejudice put people in boxes. So try and be aware of that and just notice, be hyper observant before you say anything.
But that's the communication skill, because people think communication skill is about talking. But for me, communication skill is not talking. You should know when to talk, when not to talk. If you're a good communicator, the first thing you do is to understand the situation before you say anything.
There's a sound bite in that, I'm sure, about communication. Have another question from Tanya. I have a similar experience with the speed of cultures in different European cultures as well. What do you think was your and your peers willing to be open to different cultures and behaviors? So I think what we're looking for here is how do you set people up to be open to different cultures? You obviously had this journey of your own where by the time you arrived in Japan, you were ready. What are some things people can do perhaps to open themselves up?
I think the first thing is it's very easy for people to observe that you're open or not. You know, human brain has the capacity to tell if you're faking it, unless you are an Oscar-winning actor. It's natural. What you give is what you get. So one of the things, I think, if you are seen as someone who is willing to listen, willing to, integrate yourself into the culture, there is a natural reciprocation from the other party as well. Because normally these are all built on trust, right? And it's going to take some time to build that trust among people. Most of the time, because we work in corporates, and when we move across countries, we're moving because of the job. And we think that we need to prove ourselves immediately. And this intention that I need to prove that I'm here and I need to show the results immediately sometimes drives us in the wrong direction, and making people feel, oh, you're here for your own interests. But unless we actually say this is together, we can make a difference. I'll give you one example. We had to do organization redesign I took 4 years to do organization redesign, which was a very simple change in organization structure. The reason is, when I show the organization structure, it was like, why did you need 4 years? You could have just done it immediately. The thing is, the change was not in the organization structure. The change was in the way people were working together. So it's a mindset change, it's a behavioral change, which is at an emotional level. And it's not something that can be dictated by a PowerPoint presentation, or sometimes saying, oh, this is a poster on the wall which says, oh, this is the behavior we want from you. It's so easy to say, but it is still a poster on the wall. And many times we think that organization culture has to be different from country cultures. But an organization culture is actually a combination of multiple country cultures. That's where the organization can be more successful rather than redesigning a different culture altogether. So you may be living in Japan, but if you work for Nissan, your culture has to be this. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard a wonderful example about, are we creating marmalade or are we creating a fruit salad?
Exactly.
So talking about culture.
I was very interested in our CEO when he talks about diversity in Japan. There is this chocolates with the faces of people. So it's done with a machine. I don't remember the word for it, but it's all of them look the same. So are we having an organization which has all the robots working, or are we going to have like really people? Where people, there is tension. Where people, there's culture. But where people are there, there's also beautiful assimilation.
So we've talked about how we can behave, to how we can prepare ourselves, how we can take ownership of our behaviors, take responsibility in order to integrate ourselves and respect new cultures. And we should always start with ourselves. What else can we do, though, if we're leading an organization, to bring other people on this journey with us?
Yeah, it's a good question because that's what I'm working on a day-to-day basis. But I think
I was just going to say, you've talked about how you let your team, you took 4 years about you didn't just want to impose a structure. So you talked about how you created responsibility within the team to do that. But are there other things you'd like to say on that topic?
Well, it's a tango, right? 2 step forward, 1 step backward when you do an organization transformation, cultural transformation. Because when we do cultural transformation, we're not doing for the sake of transforming culture. We're doing it for the sake of making the organization relevant for the period, right? So it's more about evolution than change. It's because you're made by your past and you cannot let go of the past. One of the things I see is it's so natural for us to start blaming the past for everything that's bad, and we think the future is all good, but actually it's not the case, right? Your past makes you. So the organization cultural change when we do, and it's from a communication storytelling point of view, is to assess what worked in the past and what may not work right now because times are changing. And after COVID, everybody knows how it changed. One of the examples I'll give is I heard so many people pre-COVID who didn't want to do Zoom calls, who didn't like Teams, who would say, oh, no, we want to do it in person. We want to listen to people. We want to meet people. In 2 years, that has changed because you're forced into accepting technology that you were pushing back on because you needed it, right? That's a forceful way of doing it, but that's one of the examples that you need to change with the times. If not, you will be irrelevant. You will be left out. I think that realization is important in corporate cultures, that I might be resistant to change, but that means we will become obsolete. So why is very important than what and how. So we normally jump to what do you have to change? How do you want to change? But we never focus on explaining to people why do you need to change and let them figure out what and how.
Yeah. So focus on the why, a very strong message that it might be to prevent us from becoming obsolete. Recognize, don't blame the past. Recognize that we are here because of the past, and we all struggle sometimes to let go of the past. But if we have a compelling why, we can make that transition, but then let people work out how and what they want to do to make the transformation. Thank you very much, Lavanya. So a couple of other points I want to, we've got just sort of 3 or 4 minutes left. Just want to make sure we cover some of the things that were mentioned in the briefing for this. We talked about leveraging individual strengths to foster an inclusive environment, enhancing direct communication, and encouraging self-advocacy among leaders. One of those you'd like to pick up on?
I think we spoke about most of them, if you look back, I think, but we did also speak about communication. Communication is about listening, not about talking. This is very important. But when you say direct communication, it is important. Yeah? It is important. The way I interpret direct communication, especially in the world where we live on social media all the time, and there's a lot of people who want to talk with the screen on, because people are not really brave enough to give their opinion without the screen. So we are wearing masks, and when you are in that environment, it becomes even more important to have a mask off. And good thing is this mask is gone, right?
Yeah, the real masks. Yeah.
The real masks are gone, but it's very important for direct communication, because we talked about mindset, behavior, and emotions. Those come when you have a direct link, a direct communication. That's why we differentiate between a mass communication that we do, okay, and advertise and say, okay, these are our audience, they are the bunch of people like this, they behave like this. It's all very important for us to do marketing, communications, and all, because we need, again, a data set. But when it comes to emotions, you are actually connecting one-on-one with people. You're really looking at what moves them, what inspires them, what motivates them, what frustrates them. That's where we need to focus on. And culture change happens in that front. It doesn't happen by doing a beautiful video which shows really nice things.
I love that. I love that. This idea of we have to get down to communicating on a one-to-one level. So by direct communication, it's one-to-one, understanding each other. Yeah, fabulous. So lastly, foretelling the future. This is a very useful superpower, I'm sure. So what would be a prediction for the future from you, Lavanya?
I wish I was an astrologer or with a crystal ball in front of me to look at it. But like I said in our earlier conversations, I think the one thing that is certain for us in the future is human relations. And everything else is uncertain. So I would say that if you want to look into the future where we have better world, because everybody is more cognizant of others. I think that is what we need to be focused on, because everything else today is very uncertain. So finding certainty in uncertainty is going to be the future that we can predict.
That's a beautiful place to end this conversation. I'm totally supportive of what you're saying. It's very optimistic and wonderful words, Lavanya. So thank you very much. I just want to finish up now by thanking you very much for joining us today. I'd like to, and your team who helped bring you to us. I'd like to thank the Women Automotive Network team for putting this together and creating these opportunities to hear from senior leaders like yourself in the automotive industry. And I'd like to thank the listeners for tuning in live this morning and or afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and for watching the recording. And if you like these sort of interviews, then you might also like, this is a little plug for me and my podcast, you might also like Career View Mirror, which is a show where I interview senior leaders and rising stars, inspiring women, inspiring men from the global automotive industry. And you'll find that on your favorite podcast platform. So thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye from us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.